What are your thoughts about how should white people think about this in terms of their responsibility? And I wasn't there, I didn't do it. Why do we have to talk about this? And why am I responsible today if I'm not sort of championing Black Lives Matter?
Well, my take on this is, being a student of human nature, is that no human being wants to feel responsible for what another human being has done.
Right.
From when my children were growing up and you saw a mess and you said, you and your brothers clean this up, and it's like, no, Jillian did it, so I'll clean up my one paper, but then they'll leave the other ketchup packets or whatever out because I didn't do those.
Uh-huh.
And I understand that about human nature. And so people have a right not to want to assume guilt for something that they don't feel they were an intentional actor in. But what the discussion around systemic isms is not about guilt. It's about responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't need anyone to feel guilty. I don't want anyone to feel guilty. And I think that's unhealthy.
One of the things that I would offer, Kathy, you have a point that you want to make?
Yeah, I just want to quickly make the point with Judy, and again, talk about, she did an excellent job talking about the disparity and talking about not assuming blame or shame or even guilt, but just acknowledgement and understanding that 400 years has impacted a people that we just cannot ignore. And somebody said gave an analogy that just really was helpful for me. If you think about a Monopoly board and you think about, that if you were playing Monopoly and somebody had a chance to go around the board 400 times, and every time they passed go, they got $200. And they got a get out of jail free card, and they bought the houses and they bought the hotels, and economically they were going up. Think about the people who had to wait 400 years. What would be the impact? So understanding that impact and acknowledging that impact doesn't mean you assume guilt. It just says, I understand how this could happen. Now let's look at restructuring to make sure, in fact, that, we make the field, a level playing field. And I think that's important. That acknowledgement is not happening. It's more, let's not talk about race. Let's not even talk about it because it hurts so bad to talk about it.
Wow. Yeah, a quick thought is as an African-American male, I've experienced authority and interactions with law enforcement on countless occasions, not only with law enforcement, i.e. police officers, but also within the court of law, which can be extremely intimidating when I knew that either one person or even a panel of folks who really weren't my peers had my life in their hand, my livelihood in their hand. That same sentiment transitioned into corporate America. When I worked in corporate America, many, many times, I knew that my manager, my supervisor, that their word could move my career in a different trajectory.
That's awesome. Let me ask you, I'm going to do some speed dating questions, and I'm going to ask you by a show of hands. How many of you are bitter? You just wake up each day bitter. Anybody? Okay. How many of you are angry at white people? Anybody? Just in general? Let's see. How many of you blame white people? Anybody? Blame all white people. Okay. Why am I asking you these questions?
I believe that there's a perception that when asked of Black people, that all the hands will go up on all the questions. There's a perception and an assumption, and this was a case in point that that's not the truth.
Right. What's the difference between stereotyping and sort of generalizing, or understanding, stereotyping and understanding some cultural tendencies? What's the difference between those two?
Well,
go on, Kathy.
and you can add on, Judy, to what I was going to say. Stereotyping, for example, if you say, so a cultural tendency would be things that happen at a high rate of frequency within that culture. Okay. So there are cultural tendencies in every group, you know, a culture of engineers, a culture of Christians, you know what I mean, culture of women. And then a stereotype would ascribe a behavior, typically negative, and would ascribe a behavior or a notion about a group by saying all that group. So for example, let me pick on women since I'm a woman here. So a cultural tendency may be that, you know, most women tend to value the feelings and emotions, okay? But a stereotype would be actually all women are emotional.
Right.
And so, and when that turns into discrimination, because all of a stereotype is when you act on your stereotype. So if you don't select a woman for a particular department to lead because you think all women are emotional, then you just embarked on discrimination.
And Tommy, one other thing I want to make reference to, because you was kind of hating on the PhD or you got to have this or that. So just a personal example, I remember going into a meeting and everybody in the room had a PhD. And they went around the table and they said, "Good morning, Dr. Brown. Good morning, Dr. Jones. Good morning, Dr. Smith." And when they got to me, the leader of the meeting said, "Well, we can just call you Karen, right?" I said, "No, I think I'd like to be Dr. Townsend today." The only difference between me and everyone else in the room was guess.
Race.
I was the only African American in the room. So I had the credentials. I got the big diploma. You get a big diploma when you get a PhD.
Right. I love that.
The business card that said M.R. Townsend PhD, but we can just call you Karen today, right?
Right. Judy, you worked at Procter & Gamble, and Procter & Gamble came out with a commercial that won a lot of awards that referenced the talk. And that's not a commercial for you. What kind of conversations have you had to have with our sons about their interactions with police and others?
From, I don't even know how early, but from extremely early ages, you know, and our children living in a suburban community have had weird run-ins with the police. I think our youngest was 4 or 5 when he was at a carnival and a police officer got called just because they assumed
that he stole a free water.
Oh, yeah.
He stole.
Yeah, he was taking too many free waters.
Right.
From the area, so they called the police. I mean,
right. But I want to go back and hit this again, Judy, because you said it in passing. You said very quickly that you wanted them to drive earlier than I did. And I don't think that people maybe even caught that. What did it mean to you that you didn't want your children, your boys in particular, driving early?
Because I felt that their lives were at risk. And I want to keep them in that protective bubble of me being a middle-aged mom driving them around who's less likely to get stopped than to have them. It feels like you're sending them out off to war and you don't know what might happen to them. I mean, even my children, who they were really cute because they were all 2 years apart when they were bobbing around in our neighborhood.
Matching vests and things.
Yeah, and I made them dress a lot in matching clothes, especially on Sundays.
Hey, I'm suburban. I'm suburban, everybody.
One of the pictures behind me.
Right.
But when they were those ages, they got a lot of, "Oh, they're so cute." And I was shocked a couple summers ago when one of our next door neighbors, who's been here since they each came home from the hospital to this house, one of them pulled up and parked on the street instead of in our driveway and gets out, and our neighbor is walking around with a gun on his property because he had another Black male friend with him. And it's like the baby that you thought was so cute and you let him run over into your yard with our puppies and everything. Now that he's morphed into a regular old black man,
He's scary.
he's so scary looking that you pull a gun out when you see him and you don't recognize him anymore with another African American male.
One of the things that I would say is that it's so important for those of you that have taken the time to listen to this fishbowl of African American professionals, that in many ways, if you look at professional sports as just an arena to take a look at, before 1947, white men sort of were the face of all professional sports, and they fought hard to keep out, people of color. And it wasn't that Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier. It was that white men finally decided to let the first one in. But here's what happened as a result of that. After all that fight to keep people out, when you let them in, all you did was get richer. Literally, if you were to ask owners of professional sports teams which bank account would they prefer, the one today in golf post Tiger Woods, or the one before anybody of color was in any of these spaces, that is what inclusion is about. And I really believe that it's so important for you to embrace that enthusiastically. I will say one other thing too, that if we had more time today, we could go around and each of us could talk about what makes us hopeful right now, because there's a number of things that we've talked about offline that make us hopeful. But because Toyota has been my largest client for 24 years, I'm going to conclude this under almost a Japanese principle of Kaizen. That all they really focus on, they focus more on the areas of opportunity and improvement than celebrating their successes. So I'm hoping that you will take away what we've shared with you here as a Kaizen opportunity to really take a look at, can I hear what they've said, understand that the positive part, it's in there, but take the wealth of wisdom and of experience and of heartfelt sharing and see if I can't utilize that as a springboard to make my organization more inclusive and less fearful of dealing with and addressing systemic racism, sexism, ageism, heterosexism. We could go on and on and on.